For 52 years, Amos and Ruth Calder kept one small spring pasture that no banker cared about. Then, a food tech billionaire bought every road around them, every farm around them, and almost every official in Red Oak County. He thought the old couple owned 46 tired acres and a leaning red barn. He was wrong. Buried in a cedar box under their attic stairs was a century-old document tying his entire $3.7 billion empire to one muddy strip of grass. And the one thing he needed most was the one thing Amos Calder would never sign away. The Calder farm sat low in Bluestem Valley, where the land dipped like a cupped hand and held water even in August. Amos had worked that ground since 1972. The year after he married Ruth in a little white church with peeling paint and no air conditioning. He was 21 then. She was 19. They had 3 milk cows, 1 borrowed tractor, and a mortgage so thin it looked harmless until winter came. The farm never made them wealthy, but it kept them fed, it kept their neighbors fed, and it kept its own rhythm. 34 Holsteins in the lower barn. Hay stacked to the rafters by October, corn on the north slope, clover in the wet ground, and in the far south corner, behind a row of crooked willows, 5 acres nobody talked about much. Ruth called it the spring lot. It was too soft for heavy equipment, too narrow for big planting, too shaded for good yield. But the cows loved it. In dry summers when other pastures went brittle and brown, that little patch stayed green. For Amos, that was enough. Then the letters started coming. At first they looked harmless, thick envelopes, polite language, interest in agricultural consolidation, opportunity for rural modernization, a new future for regional food systems. The signature at the bottom was from Prairie Meridian Holdings, a land acquisition company with an office address in Des Moines, and no one in Red Oak County had ever heard of them. Within 8 months, everybody had. They bought the Haskins place first, 300 acres on the Western Road. Then the Baum brothers sold 700 acres near the river. Then the Petersons, who had sworn they would die in their kitchen before selling, took a number no farmer could ignore. One by one, porch lights went dark across the valley. The old machine sheds were emptied. The mailboxes came down. Survey flags appeared in the ditches like little red warnings. By late spring, the Calder farm was no longer part of a neighborhood. It was an island. All around them, Prairie Meridian built fences, 12-foot chain link, motion cameras, temporary guard booths, concrete barriers where gravel lanes used to be. The fields Amos had borrowed hay from for 40 years were scraped flat by bulldozers. The orchard where Ruth had traded apple pies for eggs became a gravel staging yard. At night, floodlights burned through the bedroom curtains, so brightly she could see the shape of her hands on the quilt. The first man they sent to the house was named Lyle Gant. He stepped onto their porch on a Tuesday afternoon wearing a waxed field jacket that cost more than Amos's first tractor. His boots were clean, his smile was cleaner. "Mr. and Mrs. Calder," he said, placing a black folder on the porch rail. "We represent a private agricultural infrastructure partnership. We understand you have deep roots here. That is why we're prepared to be generous." Amos wiped his hands on a feed sack and looked at the folder. Gant opened it himself. $4.1 million for 46 acres, he said. Cash. No financing games. That is nearly 7 times your assessed value. You can buy land somewhere quiet, pay every medical bill you will ever have, and never wake up at 5 again. Ruth stood behind the screen door, still in her flour-dusted apron, looking past him at the black survey stakes lined along their fence. Amos did not touch the folder. "My father died in that bedroom," he said. "My daughter took her first steps under that maple. My wife buried 2 good dogs behind the barn. I don't know what you think land is, Mr. Gant, but it is not just dirt with a price on it." Gant's smile did not leave. "It is also not a museum," he said softly. "Progress has a schedule. Amos looked at him for a long second. Then progress can wait at the end of my driveway. The smile thinned. You are surrounded, Mr. Calder. Your neighbors have already made the practical choice. The county is excited. The state is excited. Federal incentives are aligned. I am trying to give you a friendly exit before this becomes uncomfortable. Ruth opened the screen door. It already became uncomfortable when you pointed lights at my windows. Gant closed the folder with 2 fingers. Then I will return when the discomfort has become clearer. The next morning, the real campaign began. Prairie Meridian did not threaten the Calders with one big blow. They used 100 little ones. Trucks rolled past the house every 20 minutes, even at night. A temporary rock crusher started operating on the north fence line, sending a gray powder over the garden and across Ruth's laundry. Security drones hummed over the creek. Men in reflective vests stood just outside the property line and watched Amos repair fence like he was an exhibit. Then the county changed the road. For 90 years, Willowcut Road had been public. It ran past the Calder's mailbox, down between 2 bean fields, and out to the old highway. But at a county meeting Amos was not told about until after it ended. The commissioners voted to vacate public maintenance on the lower section. Prairie Meridian took over upkeep within 48 hours. A gate appeared at the entrance. Legally, the Calders still had access. Practically, every trip to town became a performance: name, destination, vehicle inspection, delivery receipt. 30 minutes to buy feed, 40 minutes to come home with medicine. Ruth called it a cage with paperwork. Amos called the sheriff. The sheriff sounded tired before Amos finished the first sentence. Amos, I know it feels personal. It is personal when I need permission to drive to my own grocery store. They are within the letter of the agreement. The letter of the agreement doesn't have to breathe their dust. On the other end, the sheriff said nothing. And that silence told Amos what the whole county already knew. Prairie Meridian was not just buying land, it was buying gravity. Every official moved toward it. The construction crews diverted a drainage ditch and called it erosion management. The Calder's lower creek dropped to a trickle. Their cattle tanks ran low. Amos paid for water haulers with money he had been saving to replace the milking line. A trenching crew clipped the farm's phone line, then blamed an outdated map. A gravel contractor accidentally blocked the lane for 6 hours with a stuck semi. Then, in the second week of July, the power failed. The outage hit just after sunset. No storm, no lightning, no tree down, just darkness. Ruth found Amos at the breaker box with a flashlight between his teeth. By midnight, they knew the problem was not on their side. A contractor had damaged the underground service line near the new security yard. Prairie Meridian apologized in a letter delivered by hand. Repairs would take 10 to 14 business days. That night, Ruth sat beside the wood stove even though it was summer, not for heat, but for the comfort of something old that still worked. A kerosene lantern burned on the kitchen table. Its weak light made the room look smaller. Amos kept pacing. I should have sold the north 10 years ago, he muttered. I should have bought a place beyond the ridge before they came. Ruth watched him from her chair. You don't believe that. I believe I'm 73 years old and hauling water like a hired hand because some billionaire wants a rail yard. Ruth set her mug down. No, she said. He wants us to believe the rail yard already won. That line stayed in the room after she said it. The next morning, while Amos was outside checking the cattle, Ruth went upstairs looking for old storm lantern wicks in the storage crawl space. She did not find wicks. She found a cedar chest behind a stack of quilts, the one Amos's mother used to keep at the foot of her bed. Inside were church programs, ration books, a cracked wedding photograph, and a bundle wrapped in feed store cloth. Ruth brought it downstairs because the paper felt too heavy to be nothing. Amos untied the cloth at the kitchen table. Inside was a folded parchment with a blue ribbon, a county seal, and a federal stamp so faded it looked almost brown. The document was dated 1896. It belonged to Amos's great-grandfather, Silas Calder, who had settled the valley when the railroad men were still arguing over maps and water rights. At first, Amos thought it was just an old deed. Then he read the second page, and the kitchen seemed to tilt. The spring lot was not ordinary land. In 1896, when the first regional rail company wanted to cross the lower valley, Silas Calder had negotiated a federal reservation tied to Willow Spring, the natural pressure point feeding the valley aquifer. The language was old, stiff, and nearly forgotten, but it was clear. The holder of the Calder patent retained absolute consent authority over subsurface water withdrawal and commercial transit across the described 5-acre spring tract. No county, state, private corporation, or rail concern could condemn, divert, bridge, tunnel, pipe, or lay track through that tract without the written and voluntary consent of the patent holder, in perpetuity. Ruth read it twice. Amos read it 4 times. Then he sat back in the chair and looked toward the south pasture. The land everybody had called useless was not useless. It was the hinge. What the Calders did not know was that 700 miles away, in a glass tower over Lake Michigan, a billionaire named Conrad Vail had known about that hinge for months. He just did not know the Calders held the key. Vail was the founder of Helix Provision Group, a food logistics empire that sold itself as the future of automated agriculture. Prairie Meridian was one of his shell companies. There were dozens more. The project in Blue Stem Valley was called the Heartland Distribution Spine. Publicly, it was a processing and shipping facility. Privately, it was an automated cold chain hub designed to handle grain protein, dairy substitutes, and refrigerated freight across 6 states. Baseline budget, $3.7 billion. Projected subsidy stack, $900 million. Projected completion, 28 months. The map on Vail's boardroom screen was nearly perfect. Blue lines showed water intake. Silver lines showed freight rail. White blocks marked storage units, server barns, processing corridors, and loading bays. In the middle of it all sat one red square, 5 acres. The Calder Spring lot. Lyle Gant stood at the end of the conference table while Vail stared at the map. "Explain," Vail said, "why a $3.7 billion infrastructure spine is being delayed by 2 elderly people in a cow pasture." Gant swallowed. "The spring tract sits on the lowest natural pressure point in the valley. To cool the server barns and refrigeration stacks, we need the aquifer draw from that basin. And the rail connector has to cut across the same tract. The north ridge is granite. The south roadbed floods. Rerouting would add at least $380 million and likely trigger a new environmental review." Vail did not blink. "So buy it." "We tried." "Try harder." "Sir, the farmer is irrational." Vail leaned forward. "No, irrational people sell when pressure becomes pain. Rational people sell when the number becomes obscene. Find out which one he is." Gant nodded. Vail's voice dropped. "And if he is neither, make him irrelevant." The next week, Red Oak County issued an emergency infrastructure petition. It claimed the Calder property blocked a critical economic development project. It cited job creation, regional food security, and transportation modernization. It did not mention the drones. It did not mention the blocked road. It did not mention Ruth cleaning construction dust out of her kitchen every morning with trembling hands. The county judge signed the condemnation order at 6:40 on a Thursday morning. By 8:15, 3 black SUVs rolled through the gate and stopped in front of the Calder porch. Lyle Gant stepped out first, carrying a leather document case. Behind him came Sheriff Dale Rusk, 2 deputies, and 4 private security men with matching jackets. Amos opened the front door before anyone knocked. He looked thinner than he had in the spring. His face had gone hollow around the cheeks, but his eyes were steady. Ruth stood behind him, one hand on the doorframe. Gant climbed the porch steps. "Mr. Calder," he said, "the county has condemned this property for essential public infrastructure. You have 72 hours to vacate. After that, remaining on the premises will constitute trespass." Amos looked past him at the sheriff. "Dale, you planning to arrest me in my own yard?" The sheriff would not meet his eyes. "I have an order, Amos." Gant opened the document case. "You were warned. This did not need to become ugly." Amos reached beside the door and picked up a plain envelope. "No," he said. "It needed to become clear." He handed the envelope to the sheriff. "Read page 2. Gant gave a small laugh. "Mr. Calder, old deeds do not defeat eminent domain." Amos did not look at him. "Then you won't mind Dale reading it?" The sheriff opened the envelope. His lips moved silently over the first paragraph, then the second. The color drained from his face. He looked at Amos, then down again. "What is this?" "A federal land patent tied to Willow Spring," Amos said. "Filed in 1896. Recertified in 1931 after the rail merger. My mother kept the copy. County kept the index card. Nobody bothered to read it." Gant stepped forward. "Sheriff, that is irrelevant. The order is signed." The sheriff held up one hand. "Back up, Lyle." The porch went silent. Even the deputies looked at each other. Gant's face hardened. "You work for the county, Sheriff. I also work under federal law." He read the paragraph again, slower this time. "No commercial transit construction. No subsurface water withdrawal. No condemnation without written voluntary consent of the patent holder." Then he looked at the private security men. "You boys need to step off this porch." Gant stared at him like he had heard a foreign language. "Do you understand what you're obstructing?" The sheriff folded the paper carefully. "I understand you tried to use my office to enforce an order the county may not have had authority to sign." Amos finally looked at Gant. "I sent copies to the federal land office in Chicago, the Regional Water Commission, and the district court clerk before breakfast. I also sent one to your company's general counsel, because Ruth said even snakes deserve a warning before the shovel comes down." Ruth, from behind the screen door, said nothing, but she almost smiled. Gant's mouth opened. No sound came out. The man who had arrived with an eviction order left without one. Within 48 hours, the story was no longer a county fight. It was a market event. A leaked legal memo hit the agricultural press first. Then business television found it. Then environmental lawyers. Then investors. Helix Provision Group had spent $1.4 billion on land, concrete, cooling infrastructure, and rail preparation around a tract it did not control and apparently could not condemn. The word analysts used was stranded. By Friday's closing bell, Helix had lost 26% of its value. Vail's board demanded answers. State officials who had praised the project began using words like review and due diligence. The governor's office, which had been smiling in ribbon-cutting photographs 3 months earlier, suddenly claimed it had always supported local property rights. At the Calder farm, the change arrived first as silence. No rock crusher, no backup alarms, no drones. For the first time in nearly a year, Ruth woke before dawn and heard crickets instead of diesel. She lay still for a moment, afraid to move in case the quiet broke. 3 days later, Conrad Vail came himself, not in an SUV, in a helicopter. It landed in a flattened soybean field beyond the south fence, kicking dust over the willows. Vail crossed the pasture in polished boots with 6 attorneys behind him. He wore a dark coat despite the heat and carried nothing in his hands. Amos waited beside the gate in a sweat-stained cap. Ruth stood near the porch, arms folded. Vail stopped just outside the fence. "Mr. Calder," he said, smooth as poured oil, "you have created a serious problem." Amos rested both hands on the top rail. "No, I found the one you buried under my pasture. Vale's jaw tightened. Let us be adults. You have leverage. I respect leverage. My board has authorized a settlement. One of the attorneys opened a folder. Vale continued, $30 million, clean purchase. You keep the house for life if you want it. We relocate your herd. We establish a charitable foundation in your family's name. You and your wife never worry about money again. $30 million landed in the field like a thunderclap with no sound. Amos thought of winter feed bills, Ruth's prescriptions, the cracked milking parlor floor, the roof over the machine shed that leaked every hard rain. He thought of all the years money had been a door that would not open. Then he looked beyond Vale. At the torn fields, at the empty farmhouses, at the cut creek, at the places where his neighbors' barns had stood. No. Vale's eyes narrowed. 50 million. The attorneys went still. Even Ruth looked at Amos, not because she wanted him to say yes, but because any human being would need a second to understand a number that large. Amos took that second. Then he shook his head. Vale stepped closer to the fence. Do not confuse leverage with immortality, Mr. Calder. You are an old man holding a very old piece of paper. I can keep you in court until neither one matters. Amos leaned in. Then why are you here? For the first time, Vale had no quick answer. Amos opened the gate. My price is not money. Vale gave a humorless laugh. Everyone says that until the number is correct. My number is every acre you tore up. The laugh died. Amos pointed toward the north fields. You will dismantle the rail beds. You will remove the concrete pads. You will restore the drainage you cut. You will reopen Willow Cut Road to the public. You will fund soil repair for the valley. And the land you bought from families under pressure will be placed into a county agricultural trust and offered back first to the families who sold it. One attorney whispered sharply into another's ear. Vale stared. That is not a settlement, that is surrender. No, Amos said. Surrender is what you asked us to do. Vale's face turned cold. The cost of that would be catastrophic. So is building $3.7 billion of future on land you didn't understand. The wind moved through the willows. Amos lowered his voice. You thought the valley was empty because you emptied it. But the spring still runs under all of it, and the spring is mine to protect. Vale left without shaking his hand. For 9 days nothing moved. Not the machinery, not the lawyers, not the stock price which kept sliding. Helix lost lenders. The subsidy review froze. A pension fund sued the board for concealment risk. Reporters camped at the county courthouse. Farmers who had sold under pressure began speaking on camera with their faces tight and ashamed. Behind closed doors, Vale's directors stopped asking how to beat Amos Calder. They started asking how much more Amos Calder could cost them. On the 10th day, Helix accepted. Not because the company grew a conscience. Because the old farmer had made doing the right thing cheaper than continuing the wrong one. The settlement was filed under federal supervision. The rail corridor was canceled. The aquifer withdrawal permits were withdrawn. Willow Cut Road became public again. The spring lot was placed under a conservation covenant that could not be sold, leased, piped, tunneled, or condemned without the Calder family's consent. And Conrad Vale resigned 3 weeks later, after the board used softer words than fired because men like him always get softer words. The cleanup took years. The first machines to leave were the security fences. Amos watched workers unbolt the cameras from posts and load them into flatbed trucks. Ruth stood beside him with coffee in a chipped mug. Looks smaller coming down, she said. Most bullies do. By winter, the concrete pads were being broken apart. The sound was ugly, but it was a different kind of ugly. Not the sound of taking, the sound of undoing. By the next spring, soil trucks rolled into the valley, not to bury it under gravel, but to rebuild what had been scraped away. Drainage crews reset the old swales. Willow Creek was released back into its bed. Water filled the Calder tanks without a truck for the first time in 2 years. The grass returned slowly, not like a miracle, like work, seed, rain, waiting, failure in patches, more seed, more rain. Some families never came back. The Petersons stayed near their grandchildren in Arizona. The Baum brothers had already split their money and stopped speaking. But others returned. A Haskins grandson leased 80 acres through the trust and planted oats. A young couple bought the old Miller house and started raising sheep. Ruth helped them learn where the lane flooded first. Amos showed them which fence posts always rotted near the creek. The valley did not become what it had been. Land never does, but it became alive again. 5 years after the settlement, Amos Calder died in his sleep before sunrise, with Ruth's hand tucked under his and the window open to the sound of cattle moving in the dark. He was buried on the rise above the spring lot, under a bur oak his great-grandfather had planted from a seedling. There was no statue, no foundation with his name carved in stone, no billionaire fortune hidden in a bank account. Just Ruth standing at the fence after the service, watching Willow Spring move through the grass exactly the way it always had. The corporation had owned the roads, it had owned the officials, it had owned the maps, the machinery, the lawyers, and the lights, but it had not owned the water under that pasture. And it had not owned the old man who knew what a valley was worth. The machine left, the spring kept running.